This is the second video in a small series of videos I wanted to do about the distinctions of what makes a good knife become a fine knife, a knife worthy of investment. There are many knives out there, there are many good knives out there, but there are 6 basic and extremely important distinctions. And in the first video, I covered fit. Fit is something you can see from good close enlargements of the knife picture. You can also see it when you get the knife and hold it in your hand. You can detail fit pretty easily and see if there are any gaps or voids or spaces or irregularities in the fit of a knife. And I also talked about how important it was to the knife's integrity, that it, by having a tight fit, you have tight tolerances, and then you have a close relationship between, say, the handle scales and the tang that it fits to. So therefore, you're going to have a better application of force, you're going to have better longevity, you're going to have more stiffness, and all the little factors that come with fit. And as we do more and more of these videos, and I want to do a lot more of them, we'll discuss even more deep, intricate features like this. But this is the second one, and the second one I wanted to cover that is a definite distinction, and one you'll probably very familiar with when you see a fine handmade custom knife, is finish. Now, finish is the treatment of the material to a final condition, I guess you could call it. Now, there are all different kinds of ways to finish steel, and knives are finished in a variety of ways depending on where the knife comes from and who's making it. For instance, here's a little fact. You will never ever see any factory knife finished. Ever. Ever, ever, ever. They'll say, oh, it has a fine finish on it, and then you look at it, it's like, well, there are little scratches and fogginess and plainness or just flatness to it. The metal's not real, it's not real crisp and clean, the grind lines are a little washed over. There's no such thing as a factory knife making a good finish. And they don't do a good finish. Why? Because of the fact that in a fine metal, finish can increase the cost of the piece 50 to 100, maybe even 300%, depending on what you do with it. It is the most laborious part of making any kind of fine piece of anything, is the finish. And unless you're a machinist, if you're not familiar with machining and working with metals and woods and even plastics and definitely gemstone, the finish is something you don't think a lot about. You think, oh, it's nice and shiny, it's real pretty. And you have no idea unless you're a machinist, unless you've done it, I'll put it that way. Unless you've tried to put a fine finish on something with a great degree of accuracy, it's very hard to understand what it takes to achieve a fine finish. But metal manufacturers and metal workers, machinists, machine shops, etc., they know what it takes to put a fine finish on metals, and they don't want to do it. They don't want to do it because it adds tremendously to the cost of the item. But we are, after all, talking about extremely fine, handmade, custom knives in my case, and a great deal of importance is placed on the finish. There are a lot of makers, and me included when I started, I didn't do good finishes when I was just beginning, because I was just beginning. I said, well, I'll make this as fine as I can, but it didn't take me long to realize that throughout history, the finest pieces of artwork, the finest collector's works, the highest value works were always finely finished. They weren't roughly finished, they weren't hammered and scarred, they were finely finished. And if you look back through history, you look at museum quality kinds of works in the field that I'm in here, and that if you're watching this and you're another knife maker, you're in the field too. But if you look at that, you look through history, you look through museums, the best pieces had the best finish. And utilitarian pieces have a poor finish. Now, there's nothing wrong with making utilitarian knives. There's nothing wrong with that. But don't expect to pay a lot of money for a utilitarian knife, and that's a problem right now and has been for some years with knives. And the reason is it's difficult to create a fine finish. So this might end up being actually a long video. I don't intend it to be, but there's a lot to cover here. You've got to have knowledge and process and control of the material to finish it. Now, in knives, let's talk about the blade first. Okay, so to finish a blade, you have to know the blade's characteristics and if it will finish. For instance, if I make a knife out of 01 oil hardening tool steel, and it's a high tungsten chromium version of it, and it sometimes has vanadium in it, depends on your version of 01. But 01 creates, when it's properly heat treated, and that's some subject for another video, but when it's properly heat treated, it forms very hard little tungsten carbide particles. Now, it doesn't form them, what do I want to say? It doesn't form them uniformly across the steel. They're in areas. But what that translates to is, as you finish it, if you're familiar with knife finishing, it doesn't finish like, say, a high chromium martensitic stainless steel. It doesn't finish like plain carbon steel. It doesn't finish like a high vanadium steel. It has its own unique finishing arrangement and properties and steps. And maybe in the future I'll talk about those and talk about what it does take. But when you are a professional custom knife maker and you're working for decades throughout these different materials, you develop your own recipes, if you will, your own processes. More like process, not really a recipe. It's a process for finishing different kinds of steels, and they all finish different. And some will not finish. For instance, certain steels, if you want to achieve a mirror finish, you can't. You can't. And if a guy, and this is what's important to collectors and important to people who work with fine knives. A guy tells you, oh, this is a certain type of steel and it's got a real bright mirror finish, and you read on, say, on a website like Jay Fisher's site, or even better, you read on the manufacturer's site, like where the knife came from, the foundry that the knife came from, that the blade still came from, not the knife, I'm sorry. Say the blade still came from, like Sandvik or a Crucible, or any of the places that the steel is, where the steel originates. And they say something in the steel's description like cannot be brought to a high mirror finish, or can't be finely finished, or can be fairly well finished, or they'll use terminology to make it sound good because they're advertising writers, and they'll use that terminology to make it sound good. But if you have the idea that a knife can't be finished because of the steel, and then someone's trying to sell you that knife, and that knife is supposedly made of a steel that can't really be properly mirror finished, then I would suspect that that's not the steel. That's the only way. That's the only conclusion you can come to, is that, is this person not aware that this steel can't really be mirror finished? And what are they telling me? Well, the only way that you can do a steel test, for instance, is a metallurgical testing facility. And actually, I've had knives metallurgically tested before. I've got some stories to tell about that. But anyway, if it can't be mirror finished, and someone says, "Oh, I have a mirror finish. I'm able to achieve a mirror finish on it," then I would immediately challenge them and ask them, how do you do it? Tell me what steps you do. Tell me how you achieve a mirror finish, and make it clear so I understand it. If you're a knife buyer, for instance, there should be no secrets. If a person asks me, he's a knife client, he asks me, like for instance, let's take this one here. Here's a real nice little knife. Now this one is not my knife anymore, so. Brian, as of this morning, this is your knife. So this is Brian's knife. This is one that's on my website, and it's called a Temno. And you can see the finish. Let me see if I can just zoom this in here. You can see the finish on it. And of course it's not just the knife and the blade. It's the handle too. You can kind of see it in the light and see the reflection of the shininess of the finish and the fine finish that's in the knife. And anyway, let me zoom back out here. Now, where was I going with that? I got carried away. It's a beautiful, beautiful knife. Beautiful knife. Anyway, thank you, Brian. Anyway, as in a fine custom knife, that's what it was. If somebody asked me, Jay, how did you finish this steel on this knife? I have no problem telling them every single step it takes to get that finish on that knife. And when they hear it, they're like, oh my gosh, that's a lot of work. That's crazy. Well, that's why some of these knives are expensive. When you have a very fine finish, it can cost $30,000, 50, 100% more. Well, let's put it this way. It's a 30 to 80% of the cost of a piece of finely finished metal can be because of the finish, not the value of the steel, not the value of the stone, but the value of the finish. People wonder why finely finished works are so expensive. Look at jewelry, for instance. It's because it takes so much to finish them. Now with jewelry, it's a lot easier because with jewelry, you got a soft metal. You don't have hardened steel. That's why there's so much effort and so much time goes into finishing. Please forgive the dragon in the back room. Next video, I'll promise to turn him off. He'll shut off in a minute, but he's the biggest, by the way, he's the biggest motor in the shop. He's 7 horsepower and 3-phase 240 volt compressor. It's an Ingersoll Rand beauty. I love my compressor. And anyway, we'll talk about tools at some point in time, but he's pumping up now, and I'll go shut him off here in a minute. Anyway, I want to keep going. So this is a real shop after all. And by the way, when you look behind me, you see a lot of tools. I'm going to move the camera around in the shop. I think you'll be really surprised at what it takes to make fine custom knives and make a career of it. You may see some of these tools and instruments and stuff. You'll see a lot, like up here, you see a lot of storage of small parts, fasteners, drill bits, carbide cutters. All the, that's just the beginning. As I do these videos, I'll show you more and more. You'll be quite surprised at what's in this facility and what it takes. There he is. He's done. Okay, so because finish costs so much, a finely finished piece, the first thing manufacturers do, the first thing makers do, is they say, "Is there some easier way?" Now, I had a couple guys come in there, not only knife makers. One of them was the he's retired president of the American Bladesmith Society. Real nice guy, a wonderful man, a great group. They don't do what I do. They make knives a different way. We'll talk about that some point in time. But he's looking over my work and he says, "My God," he says, is that 440C? And I said, "Yeah." And he's like, "Oh man, that stuff's got so much chromium in it. How do you finish it?" And I told him, I said, "Okay, well, I do my roughing grindings at 60, 120, and 180. Then I heat treat, and then I'll do a control grinds at sometimes back to 180, or usually go on to 220, 240, 320, or 40 micron. Then the equivalent at 30 micron, and then the finished grinds are at 15 micron, 9 micron, and 5 micron, and then I go through the polishing steps. So all of those grinds are done with the abrasive belts and the grinding wheel, and they're all done offhand." And I said, and it comes out this beautiful. And if you do a good finish, by the way, if you do a good finish, let me zoom in again here. What you will see is ooh, oh, can it focus this close? I guess it can't. There it goes. There we go. Okay, so you see a nice crisp grind line. That's this line, this little line right above my finger there. That little line that delineates the flat from the hollow grind. And it's nice and crisp and clean. And a lot of makers will spend a lot of time on the buffing wheel. There was a guy I knew did when I was doing the show circuit, and he had beautiful knives, but every single one of them was just washed over, just all rounded and washed over. And they were bright and shiny, but this guy lived on the buffing machine, and that's no way to make a knife. You need to establish a very good grind, very good profile, very good flats, and say hollow grind if you're hollow grinding a knife, and then you should be able to see a clear, crisp delineation, and that grind line shouldn't be washed over by too much effort, too much work. So that's all part of finish. And finishing, yeah, a guy can stand in front of a buffer for a long time, and that doesn't mean it's a good quality finish. A good quality finish should also have those crisp, clean grind lines. And it takes sometimes many years of practicing various techniques before you can get it down. And like I said, every material takes a different process to finish. So you have different abrasives, you have different polishes, you may have a pre-polish, you have a buffer that goes after the polish. I mean, there's a lot that goes into this, and most people are surprised at how much work it takes. They say, "Oh, this knife costs a lot of money." Well, let me tell you how much work it takes. Why don't you just hang around a while with me? In fact, years ago, I had a guy. He was a writer, professional magazine writer back in magazines days, and he said, "I'm going to come to the shop and I'm going to hang out with you and watch you make a knife." And I said, "Are you kidding?" And he said, "No, I'm going to do that. I'm going to be there." And I said, "Well, it takes a long time." And he's like, "Oh no, I've got all kinds of time in the world. I'll just hang out." So I started with one. I said, "I'll make one knife," and I started grinding. And I was grinding and grinding and grinding, standing at the grinding machine, grinding away, grinding for hours and hours. And then he's like, then I stopped. And he said, "Are you done?" I said, "No, I'm changing belts." so I changed to a different abrasive belt. And he's like, "Oh my gosh, how long is this going to take?" And I said, "Well, I'll be working on this at least, if we keep going," I said, "at least into the night." He's like, "Well, how about if I come back later and we'll do it at another time?" And I said, "Sure, man." So a lot of people don't realize what it takes. Anyway, the fine finish is, it's appealing, it's professional looking, and it increases the value of the knife. And this is important. A lot of people collect very fine knives because of value. They know the investment value of a knife, and we will talk about that in a future video. Investment knives are a very good investment if they're by a well-known maker, and they'll increase in value sometimes tremendously. And I have mentioned this before. Like I said, a later video, I'm going to get off track on that. High chromium, high carbon steels, they look fantastic. But it takes so many steps of grinding and then final buffing. And by the way, most people who tell you about finish will, whether they're in the lapidary field, that's rocks, gemstone, whether they're in the woodworking field, whether they're in the steelworking field, they are machinists, metal workers, they will tell you that the finish is made in the sanding. Now when we grind knives, we don't call it sanding. You call wood sanding, just a different name for it. But sanding is the intermediate steps of say, grinding, abrasive grinding. That's all it is. And it's the same similar concept. But fine finish is made in the sanding. If you don't have good technique in the intermediary steps of grinding, you'll never achieve a fine finish. And we may talk about that someday too. Another thing I wanted to bring up is that if you are making knives out of steel and wood, that's one thing. But when you're making knives out of gemstone, you are talking about a totally different concept. Most knife makers at some point in their time, of their career or their knife making, they entertain the idea of, "Oh, I want to use some stone in a handle. I like gemstone." Now, I make more gemstone handled knives than anyone, I believe, who's ever lived. And if you don't believe that, go to the website. And if you think there's somebody else out there who's made more, please send them to me. I'd love to talk to them. Because on the website you'll see 13,000 pictures. There are hundreds and hundreds of photos of gemstone handled knives. When people say gemstone handled knives, I'm the guy. I'm very proud of this. I've been doing this for many decades, and I've made many, many, many hundreds of gemstone handled knives. And that's all real stone. But in the finish, when we talk about finish, the finish of gemstone is particularly difficult because sometimes every gemstone requires a different finishing procedure. The grinding in gemstones pretty much has to be done all underwater. It's all wet work. It's lapidary. You're using silicon carbide abrasives, aluminum oxide abrasives, diamond abrasives, and you're using them underwater. The feeds, the pressures, and everything takes an immense amount of skill and understanding. A jade polish is completely different from agate. An agate polish is completely different from, say, rhyolite, a volcanic kind of rock. Every piece of agate, cryptocrystalline quartz, jaspers, they all polish differently, and you have to have an extensive knowledge of what it takes to bring these stones to a bright, glassy, or vitreous finish. And that takes a lot of skill. And then some stones, no matter what you do, they can't be brought to a mere finish. Like the steels. Like I said, there are some steels that can't be brought to a high finish. And where the steels, there's only a few types, and you know why. Gemstones are funny. There are some that can't be, like Oh gosh, any stones that aren't particularly super hard, that are made of like sandy, petrified mud, that kind of thing, that you just can't bring them to a mere polish, no matter what. They remain flat no matter what. But most stones can be, and that brings up the value. And not only the value, it isn't just about value. Okay, so when you polish a stone, when you bring a stone to, let's zoom in again here. Ooh, get in there. Oh gosh, this thing goes way in there. Okay, when you get this stone to its bright mirror finish, you can see into the stone. You can see the depth into it. You can make out, this stone has little critters in it, believe it or not. This is a petrified agate from the Bay of Fundy. And the Bay of Fundy is up in Canada, and it has the highest tides in the world. It's an amazing place. So because it has 60-foot tides, it's ripping out all kinds of close up of the leg there. Oh, that's too close on the old face. No. Anyway, so the Bay of Fundy is like 60-foot tide, so it's just ripping the land apart and exposing all kinds of new fresh rock. There's an amazing stone in that one. There's little tiny, I don't know what they are, like little worms or coral or something in there. Once living things, probably many millions of years old. And you can see them because you've achieved a fine vitreous glassy finish on the stone. That allows your eyes to penetrate into, if you will, the very nature of the stone. It's like when we look at stones in order to judge them, and we'll do some of that in these videos, I know we will. You have to get them wet, and the wet, what it does is it kind of washes away, by getting them wet, it washes away the surface roughness that blocks your view and reflects light irregularly, scatters back at many different angles, and that's why something looks flat and fuzzy. But then when you get it wet, you can see into it more. And it's the same way with steel, by the way. You can really get a character for the steel, and holding up to the light, and sometimes use a magnifier to look at it, and you can see what the finish does for the steel. For gemstones, it's luminosity, their character, and as I said, every stone takes a different finish. And another thing is what about the sheath? This sheath is a nice little shark skin sheath. Goes with the Temno knife, Brian's knife. Anyway, the finish on the sheath should be good. The finish should be, the edges of the sheath welt should be nice and smooth and finished. The front should be finished. The surface of, say, an inlay, and this one has an exotic inlay of shark skin, that should be finished well. The belt loop should have a very nice finish on it, and it makes it smooth. It makes it also easily cleanable. It's just better, and it sometimes takes some real work to master it. So, and here's a final thing about the importance of finish. If a maker makes a knife and he tells you this is a great knife, but he doesn't care enough to finish the steel, then that says a lot about his character. Now, I'm going to touch on something that's going to raise some eyebrows, and some of the other knife makers might be quite upset by this, but I don't care, because I'm just going to tell the truth. A lot of knife makers want to take shortcuts in finish. And why do they do this? They do this because finishing a knife is hard. For instance, the least finished part of a lot of modern knife makers' work is the flat. The flat is the flat part of the knife, not the hollow grind, but this flat part up here. That's the flat of the knife, and it's the hardest to finish, because if you get it off and you're hand finishing, well, then you have to grind a little more off if you say establish a facet, and then as you grind it off, well, that throws off the geometry, so now you have to go back to your hollow grind to straighten it out. Then you have to go back to the flat. Well, makers learned a while back, and I think this all started like in the 90s. I started seeing this. They just quit finishing the flat. They said, oh, well, what I'll do is I don't want to waste time finishing the flat. It's too dang hard. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hammer it. I'm going to hammer it and put a whole bunch of hammer marks in it, and that way I'll kind of disguise it, and it'll disguise and make it look irregular. Okay, this is poor. This is poor work. I don't care who you are. And yet it's done frequently and presented to the client as if it's of some value. Oh, it's real valuable. It's a handmade knife, so it looks handmade. It looks beat up. Let me tell you something. Let's get this real clear. A handmade knife is a brightly finished, polished, expertly ground, completed work. A machine finish knife has grind marks in it, sand marks in it, blast marks in it. It's roughly finished. When someone says something, I've heard this about my work before. They've said things like, well, your knives look like they're machine made because they're polished. Every one of them is made by hand against a grinder. These guys don't have a concept of what they're talking about. What factory knife do you know that has a bright mirror polish? You won't find one. Why? Because it takes so much effort to finish them. So what guys will do is they don't want to finish the flat, so they start hammering on it, and then they're like, okay, we'll leave it black, and we'll call it the character of the knife. That's the character. And you'll see this a lot in chef's knives. And in chef's knives, this is food contact unsafe. Oh man, they don't like to hear this at all. Don't tell me about food contact. If you can't clean it, if you can't clean that blade, and you're going to use it to cut your food, and you can't get the bacteria off of it, you have no business making a knife this way and selling it as a chef's knife. And yet it's done every single day. People do it all the time. You can tell it bugs me. I mean, because it's just a lie. If a maker doesn't have the finesse to finish a knife, then fine, don't ask a high price for it. Make it a cheap knife, but don't sell it for food work because you can't clean a rough surface. You can't. Okay, I'm not going to get into this. This will make the video way too long. We're going to talk about food safety in an upcoming video or several videos because it's a very important part. I want to use food safe knives. I don't want to sell a knife to a client for food use that is in any way unsafe whatsoever, and I don't. And we'll talk about the wheres and whys and whens and hows. And that isn't one of the six distinctions, by the way. The first distinction was fit. The second distinction is finish. And I think now maybe you know why finish is so important in a fine handmade custom knife, and why it means a lot to the value and coherence of the knife. And I want to leave you with one more interesting fact. All fractures start from a surface imperfection. Think about that. An imperfection on the surface is how all fractures start. If you don't believe me, read some research papers. Don't listen to that. And by the way, if you go to the web, don't fall into the trap of AI. AI will lie to you. AI is so full of lies. AI is a great research tool, but you got to go in there and find its source. Where did this thing get this? It's told me lies before you wouldn't believe. It's kind of funny. We'll talk about that in an upcoming video. But anyway, all fractures start from a surface imperfection. Think about that. And not to mention how easy is it to clean. By the way, here let's talk about one more thing to finish. Oh, I just thought of a great new thing and I used to tell people this a lot. Imagine you have a field, you have a pasture, a big field, and it's all plowed up. It's all rough. There are dirt clods everywhere, and the rows are rough and everything. Okay, how much exposure, if you were to straighten out every single surface in that, how many square miles of exposure would there be? There would be a tremendous amount of surface exposure. Why? Because you have all these round little rough areas that are all exposed to the surface. Well, okay, let's say now we rake it out and reduce the surface well. We got rid of all the clods, and now we have a bunch of uniform little clods. And now I don't know what you're thinking. You're following me with the surface of the steel. So now we have a whole bunch of little clods. Better, reduce surface area, less square miles, less exposed to the oxygen. I want you to start thinking about oxygen. Oxygen is a killer with metals, obviously. And we'll talk about that in an upcoming video. But anyway, so you keep planing this field down. Now maybe you go crazy and you just roll it flat with a steamroller. You're gonna roll this sucker flat. You're gonna make it as smooth as it can be, and now you've reduced the surface area tremendously by the way, orders of magnitude reduction. And as you reduce the surface area now, there's less. Think about it. How good could the water? Well, let's substitute water for oxygen. In the beginning, you've got water penetrating all the dirt clods. How much will a plowed up field suck in the water? Well, it'll just dissolve. It'll suck it in like crazy. And then as you start smoothing out the field, well, water starts to stand. It's a lot harder for the water to get in. But now we run over it with a steamroller, we flattened it all out. Now there's a lot of water standing. It has a hard time getting in there because there's less surface area. There's less place for the water or the oxygen to go. Now, let's say you fill the surface of that with clay and you pack it all down. Now you've got a pond. Why? Because you've reduced the surface area and you've reduced the ability for things like water, or in the case of metals, oxygen, to have access to the surface of the steel. Therefore, water just rinses right off of it. That's why in a chef's knife, if you use this knife and you're using it to cut food or whatever, you can just rinse it off a lot of times. And then the water just falls off of it. Everybody who's had a really mirror polished piece of metal knows that. They're easy to clean. That's why they recommend smooth surfaces that won't hold debris, they won't hold bacteria, they won't hold dirt, and they're less exposed to oxygen. And that is just another factor, and I could go on and on. I know, I really appreciate you looking at these videos. I appreciate your support. And please subscribe. Let's get this up and going so I can keep making these videos. I know I have a lot to say with my big mouth. You may not agree with it. Hey, you know, drop me a line, put it in the comments. I'll talk to you. I have no problem with this. And you know, we'll work through these issues and points and peculiar things about fine custom handmade knives. And I promise you that after you listen to and watch each video, you will know more than you did, and I will probably know more than I did. So thank you for being here. Please subscribe. That's it.